Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You can find us online if you're still looking for something to do with your Giving Tuesday money at virginiainstitute.org. And who are we to judge? It takes me a while to make a decision, especially these gaslit days. Let's give a round of applause to the word gaslit, which was Merriam-Webster's word of the year for 2022. And I think all based on the discussions on talk radio, because I haven't heard it anywhere else. There was a day where if you mentioned Maricopa County, Arizona, you were talking about the great Sheriff Joe Arpaio and whatever crazy garb he dressed his prisoners in, or the tent city he made them live in to create a better environment for them to find the errors of their ways. Not anymore, no. As a matter of fact, we probably could use Sheriff Joe to ride in and straighten out the mess that is the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and their electoral board, and the fact that they have not even been able to put the finishing stamp on their vote from weeks ago. Joining us to take a look into this, Executive Director of the Election Integrity Network, Marshall Yates, is on with us. You can find him at whoscounting.us. And then if you want to, you can just put a / Maricopa there. Marshall, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
Good. Thank you for having me on. Happy to discuss the election results, if you can call them that, out there in Maricopa County. We've been fighting for free and fair elections for a long time in Arizona, and to be honest, we did not take a step forward towards that in this last election. They've only uncovered and highlighted more of these just flagrant abuses of the election system. The weaknesses of it have been exploited, and there are, honestly, in my opinion, thousands of people in Arizona disenfranchised in this last election.
I heard testimony from the Board of Supervisors meeting in which they were going to authorize the count, and they couldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. To their credit, they didn't actually verify the count and send it off to Washington yet. But testimony was given of hundreds of people who just got offline because they couldn't wait for the broken voting machines, which, by the way, the system itself is broken to begin with. And then when they all ran out of toner, seemingly at about the same time, that didn't seem hinky at all either, Marshall. So take us into what's gone on this week with the Board of Supervisors and the testimony of the election officials that said, yeah, hundreds of people walked offline. And how is that not vote suppression?
Well, what happened, and we published this in a report we did of our poll observer observations from November 8th. So we had poll observers and election workers that responded to our survey and gave us sort of what you would say is a look behind the curtain of what happened in Maricopa County on Election Day. And what they described was pure chaos. It wasn't just the toner and the ink. It was the printers, the tabulators, the entire system essentially did not go online to start the day. They reported that as of early as 8 or 6:20 in the morning, they were getting alerts from around the county that tabulators were not accepting ballots, and it appears that this was a widespread problem. It took them many hours to isolate that it was a printer issue, and I still say that kind of with a little bit of a question mark, because the reports from our observers and the election workers said there were problems with the printers and the tabulators. So to understand how the election process works in Maricopa County, you have to understand that they use vote centers. So they've shrunken an entire county, the fourth largest county in the country, the second largest voting jurisdiction in the entire country, to 223 vote centers. And so with that, you have less margin for error if something goes wrong. So when you show up, they print you a ballot. They call it ballot on demand. They print each person a unique ballot as they arrive to the vote center. So you have to print the ballot as the person arrives, and then there was a long line for that, and printer issues all day long, working, not working, printing right, not printing right, running out of toner, everything. And so a lot of the places in the vote centers were stuck to one printer operating at a time. And so then you would get your ballot, you would print it out, take it to the tabulator, and the tabulators were rejecting, some reported up to 100% of the ballots that were fed through them the first time they were fed through. So people had to try over and over and over to get their ballots to be accepted in the tabulators. Scan it 5, 6, 7 times and then spoil the ballot, try the process again, wait in line to get another ballot to just try the process again. So it really was quite of an exercise to be able to vote on Election Day. And this only affected the Election Day vote, which is heavily skewed for a Republican turnout. And so that's really where the disenfranchisement comes in, is you had people on Election Day being told from as early in the morning as the polls opening to continuing until the polls closed that the tabulators weren't accepting ballots. And really, that destroys what little trust the people in Arizona had of their election system. They've had this go on a couple times now. But then when they showed up on Election Day, this was much more widespread than what happened in 2020. And they showed up on Election Day, they'll be told the tabulators weren't accepting ballots. Some vote centers had lines that were hundreds of people long, and it really created this chaos where no one knew what was really going on or whose votes were counting on Election Day because of the massive tabulation issues. So it really was just chaos for what we described as the poll workers and the observers. They all kind of bound together to understand, because they were dealing with such a chaotic situation. One of these observers, or troubleshooters, as they were called, they were the technician troubleshooters on site, described it as a battle to count every ballot. And because every ballot was being kicked out all through the morning and the afternoon until polls closed. And that's one thing I think people need to understand, is that on Election Day, Maricopa County officials came out and said, with the 3 o'clock press conference, that everything was fixed and we figured out the problem and we're getting this addressed. But what happened a couple days later when we got these survey results from our observers, we had over 150 observers and election workers in Maricopa that have now reported. They described the chaotic system from sun up to sundown. The polls closed, the tabulators still weren't working, and they were still having printer issues. So this is a much more widespread problem that affected Maricopa County than the news media is reporting right now, and it really destroys and it is further eroded the trust in the election system in Maricopa County.
And I want to paint this picture for a listener, and I know we have listeners in Roanoke. Roanoke has the second largest percentage black population in any municipality in Virginia after Richmond City. It's just slightly behind Richmond County as well. But imagine for a moment if this had happened at all the polling places in Roanoke City. And what would have happened and what the response would have been if all of these voters in these predominantly black counties or high population concentration black counties of Virginia had the same issue happen. And just imagine what the last 2 weeks would have been like in terms of protests. And gosh, Al Sharpton would have moved into Roanoke City and been broadcasting live from the Star itself. And so when people poo-poo this, understand what would have happened had the shoe been on the other political foot. And I don't think I'm overstating that, Marshall.
No, you probably are understating it a little bit, and they would be rightfully angry and upset. And this reminds me of the 1960s Alabama. I'm from Alabama, and what it reminds me of what happened in the 1960s, the systematic disenfranchisement of an entire community. They were often showed up to precincts. One of the ways that Jim Crow would suppress votes in the 1960s Alabama was they would eliminate precincts, make them complicated, long drives to go to. That's what we saw in Maricopa County. People were having to go from one precinct to another because they'd limited the number of precincts. You'd have a long drive. And they were being told in many of those times when they showed up to precincts that votes weren't being accepted here, try someplace else. That's just like, Birmingham, Alabama in the 1960s. And then what really takes the cake is they were being told if you really want to trust the system that's not been working, put it in magical box number 3 and we'll make sure to take care of it later on tonight. And that's another thing that reminds me of what happened in the systematic disenfranchisement of the African American community before the civil rights movement. And that really underscores the full widespread systematic disenfranchisement that happened in Maricopa County to the Election Day voter. They didn't have many of these problems prior to Election Day from what we've had reported, but the machines essentially just didn't come online. They just weren't working right on Election Day. So either the test didn't work or the preparations didn't work, but something failed. And the county, Maricopa County, has yet to give a real explanation of what happened. Printer tabulation settings, it doesn't make sense to me. It only leads me to have more questions, to be honest.
And I misspoke before. They did certify the vote, but Kari Lake's campaign and Hamadeh's campaign have filed suits regarding the the certification. I don't know legally in Arizona, but politically, I was told the problem for Kari Lake and her campaign is the McCain family, and a longstanding tradition that even managed to get Barry Goldwater to move to the center after some time. That the Arizona Republicans didn't like Kari Lake, didn't like Donald Trump, and are quite happy to certify all this and send it on off to Washington, hoping that the acronym MAGA is never heard from again in the desert. And so politically and legally, this creates such a murk because, in order for a law to be enforced, Marshall, as far as I understand it, you have to have a prosecutor that's willing to pursue those laws. And even in a place like Maricopa County, the McCain family and the McCain Republicans are so powerful that a lot of people, even Republicans, are saying, nah, I'm not going to really pursue this. It is what it is. Deal with it and dust yourself off and get on with it.
Well, and so what we're dealing with is Maricopa County certified their election. As according to Arizona law, they have 20 days after the election to certify. So they waited till the last day to certify, creating that. But then there's still the state certification that's on December 5th. And that's really where this conflict of interest with Katie Hobbs comes to a head. Katie Hobbs is certifying her own election, and that really has to be looked at with a little more scrutiny, especially when there's these legitimate questions of disenfranchisement of the election day voter, which skewed heavily Republican. We're talking about 70+% of the election day turnout being Republican voters. But you also have to, the McCain, the squishy Republicans, the liberal Republicans, and this is the problem nationwide, the liberal Republicans, the 20% of them voted for Democrats, voted against Republican candidates, people that identify as Republicans but don't like America First policies or people decided to vote for the other side. And that's a real problem, too. But for election integrity in Arizona, the battle isn't over to certify this election. There still has to go through the state certification, and I would still expect more lawsuits to come about based on what our observers saw. When I read these reports the first time, what the picture I had was what I would describe as a constitutional crime scene. Mm-hmm. There were disenfranchised citizens everywhere. It was massive. It's much more massive than people understand at this point. I mean, we had one person telling me that they watched people literally rip up their ballots in frustration and walk out rather than go through the vote carousel again of spoiling a ballot, getting another provisional, and hoping that ballot would be accepted by the tabulator. People were ripping up their ballots in protest and leaving because their ballots weren't being accepted. If that's not disenfranchisement in America, then nothing ever will be.
Marshall Yates is on with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. He's the executive director of the Election Integrity Network, and all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, we couldn't care less which party wins an election as long as everyone feels like, okay, my votes were counted. And when you see mass vote harvesting across the country and people just showing up with baskets of votes and elections officials saying, hey, great, look at all the votes you gathered from your neighborhood. And no chain of custody protections on where those votes came from or who cast them, little, if any, double checking on those. And then you wind up in Maricopa County, Marshall, with this. Now, explain Drawer 3. This is what was happening to, from what I understand, a lot of the voters who couldn't get the scanners to accept their ballot. The election officials finally, after a period of time, would say, just give me this, it'll go into Drawer 3 and we'll get to it later. How does that dovetail with making sure anyone feels confident about an election result?
Well, it really doesn't. And Drawer 3 is on the tabulator. So the tabulator sits on there. You can feed into it. So if your vote is accepted, it goes back and feeds into a bin that is on top, that's underneath the tabulator. And so that's what they describe as Drawer 1 and 2. But the problem is the bucket for Drawer 3 also rests under the tabulator. So those votes, in a lot of places, the divider between those votes that were supposed to keep them separated was breached because you had so many Drawer 3 ballots coming through at an alarming rate that the storage container separating Drawer 3 and 1 and 2 was busted because there were so many. And so you saw commingling of these Drawer 3 and ballots that were tabulated all day long. And so a lot of these places didn't find this out until when they went to shut down, and then they opened up the tabulators to gather the votes to send them to the central facility, and they saw that they were completely commingled all day long. There was no way to unspoil the ballot. So it's just a widespread mess. And it's just massive incompetence or corruption. And really, we have to get down to the bottom of it, because we have to push for free and fair elections. And what they had in Arizona was not a free and fair election, unfortunately.
Now, the machines, what sort of machines were these scanners? Because we've heard even the security and intelligence community in Washington, as reported by the Associated Press, have turned on the Dominion machines and said, they may be hackable, and probably some of them were. What machines were Maricopa County using? Were they the Dominion machines or a different make? And if so,
yes, they were. They're actually the only county in Arizona that uses that type of system. And so I don't know, I wouldn't say anything about hacking or anything. What I would just say is that these things are dangerously complicated, and they had no margin for error, and they just did not function appropriately. They didn't turn on and sync up and work right on Election Day. There was just a system-wide outage. And so they didn't work right on Election Day, and that's something we need to be concerned about all over the place.
Sure.
Is all of our election systems turning on and functioning appropriately the morning of the Election Day? I mean, here the answer is unequivocally no.
So what fixes then need to be done? How is it one county is allowed to have one type of machine and another isn't? I understand I don't want federalized election law, but isn't there a statewide standard? I know there isn't in Virginia either, and I don't understand how, if the states are supposed to be the arbiters of these elections, we can have little county backroom deals with Tony's computer service.
Well, yeah, it really should make you question the integrity of the entire system. But, our elections run on the federalist principle where the local elections should be run at the local level. And that's really what we have. We don't have a federal election. We don't have many state elections. These are all local elections. And so they were administering that way, and, they should have this discretion. But really what we need is a judge to look into this situation in Maricopa County, the widespread disenfranchisement, and put some scrutiny into it. And so far, judges have been unwilling and unable and shirking their duty to look into these election-related matters sufficiently. They're so quick to bury their heads in the sand, and you really can't expect any of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors to do anything, because they're the ones who made this either incompetent or corrupt deal with handling it. And they just created such a bureaucratic nightmare with the complicated aspects of running it. They changed the procedure on these technicians and workers in the middle of the day because they have so many of these door number 3 ballots. They sent out procedures that told everybody what to do with black bags, and then at 3 o'clock on Election Day, because of the chaos, they sent them conflicting instructions. And so this is really not a way to manage an election at all. You have an administrative nightmare, and that's what resulted in the chaos on Election Day.
So I've watched the judicial system not want to weigh into this, whether it come down to investigating somebody like Hunter Biden just to find out if he is connected to foreign governments, or look into these election issues, saying the election is settled and stop asking because that's un-American unless you're a gubernatorial candidate in Georgia. Marshall, what happens next? You mentioned that now the governor of Arizona is going to have her own administration go through these election results. Is there a way to get a special prosecutor assigned, somebody, Inspector Hochner from the BAU, somebody to come in there to watch the counting of these and the certification of them?
Well, really, you can't even have a recount because there is so much just massive chaos with the ballots. So it's not even about counting it. It's about hearing from the number of people that were disenfranchised and whether a judge is willing to look into that or they're willing to pursue a legal strategy. I saw one of the counties in Arizona so far has refused to certify their election out of protest of what happened in Maricopa County. Now that has gotten threat from Katie Hobbs. She's suing them now in response to it and trying to force them into it. But really, somebody has to stand up in Arizona and say enough, because the conflict of interest right now is becoming so apparent you can't ignore it, and it really corrupts justice and corrupts people's trust in Arizona. And that's the thing you can't do, is you cannot continue to tell these people you trust your elections and then run these shoddy elections that nobody trusts. And we're talking about the people who don't trust it are the election workers and observers who were there that day. They're the ones telling us they don't trust what happened based on what they witnessed in person. So it's much more than just anecdotal evidence. We're talking about the people that were running the election saying it was run so poorly, we cannot trust and verify the outcome of this. We weren't able to verify and reconcile the number of people that checked in with the number of ballots into the end of the night. They were having ballots created. They were having hundreds of extra ballots created because of the process of trying to do the vote circus, of having to spoil a ballot, hopefully spoil it, then try another ballot into the tabulators. So there's thousands of ballots that are potentially just been thrown about out there, handled without care. And these workers were not, they really did a valiant job. These people that volunteered on election day to work and were paid by the county, they did a great job. But under the circumstances of the incompetence given by the county, Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, all they could do was just say at the end of the night, here's a bag of ballots. They gave them 2 black bags, but they had no verification, no sorting, no standardization of the reconciliation of the number of people that checked in with the number of ballots, and they watched people leave in protest all day long. They said this is not a fair and honest system. So we need changes across the board, but you're right, and really the conflict of interest of Katie Hobbs certifying her own election, it's only going to create more problems and more distrust of the entire institution that underscores our constitutional republic in this country. And when that's at risk, like it is in Arizona, it's at risk everywhere. People have to trust their elections because everything stems from that.
And, of course, this is a world where President Biden just announced we're going to open up oil and work with Venezuela on drilling oil there as long as they promise to work towards a more democratic future. Maybe we can send the same folks from Maricopa County down to Caracas to help them with their next election, Marshall. Marshall Yates is on with us, Executive Director of the Election Integrity Network. You find him online at whoscounting.us. You can read about Maricopa County, certainly, and that has grabbed a lot of the headlines. What is the possibility, Marshall, of a revote? I keep hearing people talking about this has to go to a revote. We have to basically tear up the vote and start all over again. And why would somebody be against that if all the same citizens are still there in Arizona and nobody kind of flew in to help out? A revote shouldn't be a problem for somebody, especially if they won like Harry Lake did. I mean, Katie Hobbs did.
Well, that's if you don't put the whole thing into question. Yeah, well, they honestly don't want to go through the chaos, I guess, of the election day again because it's Maricopa County supervisors and the recorders are still administering this election, and you're looking like you'll have chaos again because the way that they set it up was set to fail. It wasn't set to run according to plan or the backup plan. They had too many backup plans. These are pointy-headed bureaucrats in an office trying to tinker and engineer an election rather than let people vote free and fairly. I'm an optimistic person. I hope that there's a chance that a judge will look at this and say, look, we got to go back to square one. What happened there was massive disenfranchisement. We have people testifying. We have testimony. We've accepted affidavits to describe this problem as more widespread than what Maricopa County has reported. They've said they're investigating at least 84 of the 223 precincts for this outage. But in my opinion, it's probably much higher than that. See, our roving attorneys that were set up in Arizona, there's 11 of them. They visited 115 vote centers on Election Day and saw that there were material problems with 72 of them. That's 62% of these vote centers on Election Day were experiencing material problems. Mm-hmm. And that was from sun up to sundown. So really, it's just quite an alarming situation when you talk about free and fair elections, what happened out there. I hope there's a chance for it. I hope that a judge will consider holding up the certification of the statewide vote on December 5th. But, the battle for election integrity has to wage on. We cannot continue to have this, or people will stop voting. And when people stop voting and they lose trust in the system, it affects our constitutional framework of our country in a very, very bad way, where you have people eroding confidence in election over and over and over again, and they're just told to shut up and sit down. But really, they're right to worry about it, and they've been worried about it for 2 years. They've been worried about the tabulators working, and to be honest, everything that happened on Election Day only confirmed their suspicions and then some, because it was much more massive than in 2020. In 2020, there was a rejection rate of the tabulators of 11%. And these tabulators that we got testimony regarding the tabulators, they're talking about observers were watching the first time people put their ballot to a tabulator, a rejection rate of 100%.
Oh, my gosh. Well, then let me ask you this: considering this, and I don't mean to cast this aspersion, but when the balance of power in Washington relies on this, or the Senate race in this, Masters was polling ahead, and you see these things. I think for even for a Democrat, they're going to want to know: is our guy, or is this the fix-in, or have the political parties just become so hell-bent on just win, baby, like the old Oakland Raiders slogan?
Democrats are fine with this if they win. That's what is proven time and time again. They're fine with it if they win, but if they don't, then they're going to cry foul like after they did in the 2000 presidential and the 2004 presidential election when they went to the House floor to object to the certification. They cried foul then, but when they win, they're fine with it. And that's the problem is it's continued to happen here, and they have no incentive to try to fix the problems because they're the ones benefiting from it. So they're kind of benefiting from this rigged, corrupt, incompetent system. And the citizens have lost trust, and they'll turn her home. And it doesn't matter what the polls say. The polls are judging people that are going to show up, and that's 72% of the election day turnout. If 5% of those people didn't turn out, the polls are materially wrong at that point because you have 5% of the people that just went home out of pure disgust and distrust of the entire system because they heard the tabulator weren't working. That throws your polls upside down right there. Is if 75% of Blake Masters' vote was turning out on Election Day, and some of them stayed home because of the chaos that they were hearing about unfolding at a majority of these vote centers.
Well, and you also get to the point where if I only have an hour for lunch, and I know federal law says that an employer is supposed to allow you time to go vote on Election Day, but a lot of employers don't, and a lot of states have not been very strict about enforcing those provisions. If I only have an hour for lunch, or I get home and it's coming close to I've got to get out. It's not even a matter of whether I want to stay or not. Some of the testimony I've heard from Arizona where people are like, I just can't stay any longer for this.
Yeah, I mean, they were given every obstacle, every hurdle to prevent them from voting. That's what you have to understand about this disenfranchisement. You had people trying to go vote at lunch, the line being around the block, hours long, the tabulators not working, rumors coming out that none of the ballots were being accepted. The people that were coming out of the voting centers that had just voted were talking about the problem that they had. So you had a very long process. And to that, people tried to come back after lunch later in the night, and they were still having the problems as the polls closed. So this was not something like, even if it got fixed after lunch, you could come back after lunch. Well, what we've learned from our observers is the problems continued past 7 p.m. at night. So even if you came back after work, you weren't voting. And some of these centers, what we've heard is that they had long lines, but some of them just didn't even have their machines working at parts of the day. So even if there were lines, it was just congregations of people waiting for these machines to come back online and accept ballots. And we're dependent on these machines in Arizona because they're the ones who print the ballot for you. So if the printer is printing a ballot or having trouble with it, then you can't even get a ballot. So we had trouble getting a ballot and then those votes being accepted. And so really there's no much more disenfranchisement that you can give that if they're not printing you a ballot, and if they are giving you a ballot, then it's not being accepted in front of you. That really causes people to have fear and distrust of the system. And you can't blame them when it keeps happening again and again and again. This is the third election in a row with it.
Well, and at some point you have to say, who's causing this, this malaise, and that I guess is, as we go back, Marshall, to the beginning of this, as you mentioned, this is the third year they've had this problem. What do we have to do? Do we have to get UN inspectors? We used to give the UN inspectors to watch elections, Baker and Carter and these folks. Do we have to ask the UN to send somebody in from London to observe our elections?
Well, the Department of Justice said that they had these observers on site from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division down there during the election, but you haven't heard a peep from them. And what we've heard from our poll observers is they're crying out because what they witnessed was a crime scene of disenfranchisement. They had to deal with the traumatic stress that day of trying to help every person's ballot be counted and the ballots not being taken for hours. So you had this systematic rejection of the tabulated ballots in the morning period, at least for hours upon hours. These issues weren't resolved quickly in an expedited manner at all. So you have to question if those people were the Department of Justice attorneys, the observers, UN inspectors. They would be in Maricopa County. Did they see anything? And if, like you said earlier, if the shoe was on the other foot, and this happened to the African-American community in Philadelphia or Atlanta, you would see Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton they would burn down Ferguson, Missouri.
So let me ask you this, Marshall, before we let you go. This is Maricopa County. We were talking about this a couple of weeks ago as well. In Las Vegas, they just approved, what do they call it, the Take 5 system. It's another kind of ranked choice voting because Alaska was a mess. Now, certainly a state always known for their above-board government and trustworthiness. Las Vegas or Nevada is going to do this ranked choice. We're just running breakneck into some of the most ridiculous, untrustworthy election systems I've ever seen. How are we supposed to get better from this?
We call it rigged choice voting. It's completely complicated and undermines and makes it so complicated you can't even tally the votes in a clear manner of time. So one of the ways they push this rigged choice voting on people is you give 3 or 4 options so you have an automatic runoff. Well, it doesn't expedite the process because it takes so long to count the second and third and fourth options that they still have to wait weeks for these things to tally. That's what happened in Alaska. But luckily in Alaska, they're already fighting to have this rigged choice voting system repealed. And it came about during the 2020 election. And this is a problem that's popping up all across the country. And voters need to stand firm. And in my opinion, this violates the constitutional principle of one man, one vote, because each person is getting multiple votes, multiple bites of the apple when they get to rank the candidates 1, 2, 3. So your second round vote, you get an extra vote for number 1. I mean, it's really built backwards, and to me, it's very alarming what they're trying to do here. And you got to look at who's trying to push it and why, because what they're trying to do is elect people. You're electing the person who finished second. In so many of these cases, you start with whoever gets the first number of votes from the first gets close to 50%, but then all of a sudden, every time it happens to be the second most popular person on the first ballot, they end up winning. But it's just such a confusing system with 1, 2, 3, 4, eliminating the bottom option and then retallying it. It's so complicated, it really makes you question why people are pushing this and who's behind it. And we really need to look at that before anybody accepts this. And it would be disastrous for Virginia if it instituted ranked choice voting. It's a whole rigged system and further compounds on the weaknesses of the system. It'll only exacerbate the troubles in our election system going forward.
Well, Marshall, just so you know, there has been a political action committee started by a delegate from Charlottesville, Sally Hudson, and you can imagine her political affiliation if she is the delegate to the House of Delegates representing the city of Charlottesville. And she's got a political action committee that is pushing for ranked choice voting statewide here in Virginia, or as you said, rigged choice voting. And we would never see a political party say promote a third-party candidate just to make sure that 50% wasn't achieved in any of these things. That would never happen, right?
I never say never anymore. You could see this happen. You could see the left and the right team up to push out the conservatives, because that's what's ultimately going to happen. Is it's going to make it so you have this push towards the left. You're allowing the left to gain more ground on conservative beliefs because they're trying to they're further rigging the system through the ranked choice part to protect and entrench Democrats or liberal Republicans. And that's really a fear when people, the majority of people that vote for the first ballot, their voices are being discarded, and it's really alarming. And I really hope, it's in Maine, it's in Alaska, it's being pushed in Nevada, it's being pushed in Virginia. Conservatives need to stand unified. Republicans need to stand unified. Everybody that cares about election integrity needs to stand unified to oppose this rigged choice system.
It's going to be a campaign issue in 2023 for sure. Marshall, thank you so much for your visit this week in Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We very much appreciate it, and you have a wonderful weekend.
You too. Good talking to you.
whoscounting.us is the website. Coming up next, our partners in the Virginia Education Opportunity Alliance, Americans for Prosperity, have a new statewide director. We'll meet C.J. Saylor next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.